The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, John Michael McGrath and yours truly discuss Doug Ford's reaction to Donald Trump's inauguration. Then, just how well is Ontario doing at teaching civics to high school students? That's all ahead on the agenda. Hey, partner.
Oh, sir.
Little sugar to start out with, as
Absolutely.
always. What are we wearing today?
This is Mr. DNA, which people might remember from Jurassic Park, if you remember that very specific joke from like the first act of Jurassic Park. My wife has been lobbying for me to wear this shirt on the show for some time now, and I finally made it good.
Sounds like companies across the province ought to be hiring your wife as a lobbyist, because she seems to be very successful at what she does. You know that Star Trek shirt you had on last week?
Yes.
We went to Roma this week, right? The Rural Ontario Municipal Association Conference. Do you know how many people came up to me saying, wow, that shirt JMM wore, that Star Trek shirt, that was amazing. He's got to wear that again. People care about what you wear, apparently.
It surprised me the number of rooms I walked into where I was wearing a suit and tie.
Yes, you were.
Which I don't wear often.
No, you don't.
But no, people were disappointed.
Yeah.
And you?
Yes, there is an explanation behind this, because I guess I was rooting around in the attic at home or something, and I found a bunch of old T-shirts that I have saved over the years from political leadership conventions that I have attended.
Right.
And I thought I'd pull this one out today. It's in French on the front.
Yes.
And I'm going to twist around here and show you the back of it, which is, I am the Leighton Legacy. And this T-shirt I got 23 years ago tomorrow at the NDP leadership convention that picked Jack Layton to be the leader. He won on the first ballot over Bill Blakey. And I
was
found
at that conference or convention.
Were you at that one?
Yes, I was.
I found a lot of old T-shirts, so I'm going to be kind of bringing them out in a nonpartisan way, all parties represented over the next period of time, whenever a significant anniversary happens. I had a choice today, actually, because I think 2 days from now is the 12th anniversary of when Kathleen Wynne won her leadership convention at Maple Leaf Gardens.
Yes.
But I'll have to bring that one out next year. This one, it was Le Bon Jack pour aujourd'hui for today.
Excellent.
There we go. Oh, and one last thing. Let me bring that picture up. Both the guys in that picture are named Mike Harris.
Yes.
There's Mike Harris, the former Premier of Ontario, and Mike Harris Jr., who is his son, who is in the current cabinet of Doug Ford. And we're bringing this picture up because Mike Harris, the former Premier, 22nd Premier of Ontario, is 80 years old today, which is, now let me think about that for a second, yesterday. 80 years old yesterday.
Yes.
Mike Harris. So happy birthday to the 22nd Premier of Ontario.
Absolutely.
And with that, let's get to issue one. There is a high likelihood that we will see an election called next week or the week after in Ontario. So we thought it might be a good idea for a Civics 101 on how we do elections in this province. So, JMM, let's go through this, okay? Who essentially fires the starter pistol to begin an election campaign?
Formally speaking, it's the Lieutenant Governor. Legislatures are convened on the authority of the Crown, and they are dissolved on the authority of the Crown. So in this case, it is the Lieutenant Governor, the representative of the Crown here in Ontario, who dissolves the legislature on the advice of her First Minister.
Who's the Premier?
Who is the Premier, Doug Ford. So formally speaking, it's the Lieutenant Governor's decision. Practically speaking, the Premier is the one who maybe has his hand also on the starter pistol, pulling that trigger.
Gotcha. And he will, he will inform, his office will inform the Lieutenant Governor that the Premier would like to come see the Lieutenant Governor, the King's representative in the province of Ontario. They will meet, they will chat. They will not talk about an election for the first 10 or 15 minutes of the
How
chat.
are the kids?
Yeah. No, they'll get caught up in all that kind of stuff. And then he will say, Your Honor, I am, as your First Minister, recommending that you dissolve the legislature and draw up the writs for the 44th general election. And draw up the writs means what?
A writ of election is it is a piece of paper, an instrument of state that says there will be an election held in this riding. Now, there are 124 ridings in Ontario's current electoral map, so there are 124 writs that the Lieutenant Governor needs to sign. We've actually, they've put out photos in previous elections of the LG sitting at a very well-appointed desk, usually with the Chief Electoral Officer at her side, and they just go through a stack of papers, and the LG signs one. I imagine there's also a stamp involved. There usually is in these kinds of processes. And yes, one writ for every riding.
Now, I need to ask a key question here. During the course of the Lieutenant Governor signing each of those 124 writs, will she ever drop them on the floor? Because everybody says it's time to drop the writs.
No. So
that is the correct answer.
We refer to the writs being drawn up, or I mean, formally speaking, in the letter of the law, it's the writs are issued. The writs of election are issued. But colloquially, you will often hear people say "drop the writs," and that irritates some people like yourself.
Correct. And we did one of these, right? We did a Nerds on Politics YouTube feature, so people can actually go find that. Go to the Google machine, find Nerds on Politics, drop the writs, because, yes, I find that one of the most offensive things you can say during an election campaign, because no one drops writs, they draw them up.
Aside from calling her the Lieutenant Governor.
Oh, that's another bad one. That's another bad one, right. Now, once the writs are drawn up, the campaign is on. The law says that elections in Ontario must be called on a Wednesday, held on a Thursday. So, if next Wednesday the election campaign is in fact called, what does the law prescribe in terms of how long the campaign must be?
So the election period lasts for about 28 days. So if the writs are drawn up on Wednesday, January 29th, the election will take place 5 Thursdays thereafter on February 27th, 2025. If it is called the week after, then the campaign would begin on Wednesday, February 5th, and then would culminate on Thursday, March 6th. I want to say that this is all different from federal election law. This is one of those cases where federalism matters. We have different rules nationally, and we also have different rules in other provinces, but this is what Ontario's election law currently says. It's also important to note that this is the start of what we refer to as the writ period. This is important for campaign spending law, right? At the moment, we've gone through this before. We are not in a regulated campaign spending period as you and I record this podcast. There is a pre-writ period that the Ford government expanded with its campaign spending legislation, where up to a year before a scheduled election, it regulates the spending of political parties and third-party advertisers. We are not in that period right now because we are so far ahead of the next scheduled election. So it is only with the beginning of the writ period that the campaign spending rules will kick in. They will apply to both political parties and third-party advertisers.
Let me just do one more thing on the timing. I remember when I was a kid, election campaigns in Ontario used to be at least 6 weeks long, and we can remember, I think it was the 2015 federal election. Stephen Harper was the prime minister, and he was kind of flatlining in the polls. Nothing was going on, and he wanted to give himself as much time as possible in order to mount a bit of a comeback. And so he decided to have, I think, a 70 or 75-day writ period, a very long campaign. But that shows you, federally, they can kind of go from as few as 28 days to as long as 75. But in Ontario, it's prescribed, right? Yeah,
it is set out in law. I will say the one caveat here is that dissolving the legislature and issuing the writs can happen independently. That happened in 2014 when the minority Wynne government fell. She asked for the dissolution on, I think it was a Friday, and the writs were not issued until the following Wednesday. So a little bit of ambiguity there, but otherwise the length of the campaign is more or less set in stone.
Now, I know there's a joke going around that says people shouldn't vote, it just encourages them. But, we here at TVO believe in voting, and we think you should vote, and we should let you know that the polls open on Election Day at 9 a.m. They close at 9 p.m. Sometimes, if there are some irregularities, for whatever reason, they let the polls stay open a little longer. Bad weather, very long lines, whatever. But basically, it's 9 to 9. And everybody is supposed to get, by law, 3 hours off work in order to let you go vote. So we put that on the record as well. Now, lest we bury the lead here, Ontario does have a fixed election date law. The next election is not scheduled to take place, technically, until June of 2026. So why is it that we might be having an election any day now?
Right. So Premier Dalton McGuinty created that fixed-term election law. The idea was to level the playing field amongst political parties. The Liberals certainly believed in 2003 that the Tory government of Mike Harris, who we mentioned earlier, and Ernie Eves had sort of played games with election timing for partisan advantage. There is, however, a bit of a loophole in the law.
A bit?
So,
yeah, I'd say it's a Mack truck, but anyway, yeah.
So remember what I said about, the Crown convenes the legislature, the Crown dissolves the legislature. The law cannot change that power of the Crown. And so it says right there in the plain text of the law that while this is the date the election should happen, nothing in this law affects the power of the Crown. And so that's the Lieutenant Governor who, despite the text of the law, still retains all of the power to dissolve the legislature on the advice of her first minister. We did actually just put out another Nerds on Politics video on this topic. Again, go to the YouTube machine and punch in, I guess it'd be like Nerds on Politics election or something, and you will find it there.
Okay, now the Premier's explanation for the moment seems to be Donald Trump just started a 4-year term. I, the Premier, only have a year and a half left in my term, a little less actually, so I want to try to renew my mandate now so I can be on, if you like, even terms with Trump. We both have fresh 4-year mandates. People will decide for themselves whether they think that's a reasonable explanation for the early call, and you can be sure the opposition leaders will bring that up during the course of the campaign, as they already have, actually.
Yes.
Now, okay, before we move on from this section, we got a lot of polling that's come out lately, so we should take a look at some of the polls, which might lend a bit of a hint as to why Doug Ford wants to call this early election. What do we know?
So, as you say, we've had a bunch of polls come out lately. I'm going to just go through a bit of a list in no particular order. We have liaison strategies have the Tories ahead by 9 points ahead of the Ontario Liberal Party. The Liberals have seen, according to their polls, a 5-point rise since the start of the year. Is that tied to Justin Trudeau's departure from the federal scene? I don't know. I don't think it's crazy to speculate that it might be, but we will see. Very different poll result from Léger, which shows the PC party ahead by 24 points of the Ontario Liberals. Léger really showing an unchanged or very, very similar result to, frankly, what we saw in 2022 with the Liberals and the NDP very, very far back of the Progressive Conservatives. We also got a Main Street poll. This is, I think, more similar to the Liaison Strategies result, which showed that among decided and leaning voters, the PCs are ahead of the Liberals by 10 points. Again, a bit more similar there. But then we have campaign research and Nick Kouvalis. This is the firm being used by the PC party. Kouvalis has a long relationship with Doug Ford, and Kouvalis put out some of his recent polling results on X, formerly Twitter, and he showed a very, very large lead for the PCs across every demographic, every region. And as I say, this is polling that this gives us, I think, the clearest sign of what Doug Ford is basing his decisions on right now.
Mm-hmm. They may all have different numbers, and there is a reasonable explanation for that. They could be in the field at different times. Yes. They could be surveying different people. They could be weighting different things. They don't just take the numbers back. They said they have different formulas by which they weight them.
And using different methods, right? Liaison in particular uses robocalls, like IVR, the automatic phone polling, whereas others use online panels.
Yeah, and some include undecided voters in their polling. Others don't. You saw one of the last ones there. They only have decided and leaning voters. So different methodologies here could bring back different results. What they all have in common is Ford, Crombie, Stiles,
yep.
PCs, Liberals, NDP. And this is the part of the program where I always remind everybody, polls are an excellent indication of what people thought yesterday. They are not predictive. They do not forecast outcomes. If they did, we would not need to bother with election campaigns because it would be all over and done with on day one. No, it's not over and done with on day one. Frequently, there is a change of public opinion during the course of a campaign because campaigns matter. So we keep all of that in mind as we consider all this.
And very briefly, you mentioned the 2015 election where Justin Trudeau went into that election, I believe, in third place in most polls and emerged as the Prime Minister leading a large majority in the Commons.
There you go. And with that, we're off to issue 2. ROMA, the Rural Ontario Municipal Association, that's the mayors and reeves and wardens and town councillors from all over the province. Well, they met earlier this week in the provincial capital to discuss issues of mutual interest. Doug Ford showed up, gave a speech, took aim at the U.S. and their booze. Have a listen.
And I've sent a direction to the LCBO, these tariffs come, to clear off every bit of U.S. alcohol off the shelves. Let's start promoting more Ontario-made wines and the vodkas and spirits. That's what we need to do. We're the largest purchaser of alcohol in the entire world. They will feel the pain. I will make sure I communicate this to our other premiers that they should be following suit.
Well, no surprise that got a big hand because, of course, all the wines and spirits and everything, those vineyards are all in rural Ontario. So,
absolutely.
And that's who's there at that conference.
Distillers buy Ontario grains, right? Like this is all part of the Ontario economy. The last time then and now again, President Trump imposed tariffs, it was over Canadian steel and aluminum. Canada responded by applying tariffs on a range of products from ketchup to whiskey and bourbon. Florida orange juice always comes up because Florida is another Republican state. As the Premier mentioned, right, the LCBO is the largest single purchaser of alcohol in the world. So, a few podcasts ago we mentioned non-tariff trade barriers, right? This is the kind of example of, while tariffs are federal jurisdiction, this is the kind of thing that a province can do when it wants to impose a little bit of economic pain on the Americans. And can I add one other thing? It's interesting that the Premier, or it's notable that the Premier has given this direction now, because when an election call comes, we go into what's called the caretaker convention, where the powers of the government are supposed to be substantially constrained. They are not supposed to be able to they're not supposed to be able to use the power of the government for electoral gain. So the Premier has issued this policy in advance, and if the Trump administration does respond with tariffs on Canadian goods during the election campaign, the LCBO will be able to take this direction that was already put in advance, and they will be able to act on it, even though the caretaker convention might not have allowed the Premier to do that during the campaign itself.
I think that the loophole in the caretaker convention, though, would be if you're going to take a controversial decision in the middle of a campaign, as long as the opposition parties are on side with it, then it's okay. And I remember well, this came to a head, how long ago was it? More than 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, when the then Premier, Dalton McGuinty, in the middle of an election campaign, canceled one of the natural gas-fired gas plants in Mississauga, I think, which was a very
and Oakville.
Yeah, and it was a very controversial decision, but both of the opposition parties would have done the same thing, so it didn't turn into a constitutional controversy.
Yes, exactly.
There we go. Now, I have a little interesting tidbit about ketchup.
Okay.
Since we were talking about that a second ago. You want to hear this?
I'm always fascinated how often ketchup comes up in Ontario policy.
Well, this one, full credit to Matthew O'Meara, our producer here, because he found out that Donald Trump is related to Henry J. Heinz, the founder of the Heinz Ketchup Company. Heinz is Trump's second cousin twice removed, which may explain why Donald puts ketchup on everything that he owns.
So,
anyway.
Aside from the fact that Ontario grows a lot of tomatoes, and in fact, for a long time we had a Heinz factory here, putting a tariff on Heinz ketchup last time was a bit of a personal jab at the Premier.
A little shiv to the then president, and now president once again. Anyway, let's move on here. We're off to issue 3. Monday was the second inauguration of Donald Trump as the 47th President of the United States. Canadians were warned that as early as his first day as president, he would impose massive tariffs on our goods that we export into the U.S. Didn't happen. Instead, the president mused about a trade review and then said the tariffs would happen on February 1st. Okay, so where are we now with all this?
Well, so at least initially, the justification for the tariffs coming from he was then president-elect, the justifications for tariffs against Canada had to do with claims about border security and fentanyl crossing the U.S.-Canada border. This is a claim that lacks evidence. According to the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, less than 20 kilograms of fentanyl crossed the Canadian border into the United States, while 9,000 kilograms went from Mexico to the United States. And that's not even including Pacific and Atlantic ports, or for that matter, the amount of fentanyl that is made within the United States. Trump also mentioned using, I guess they described economic force as annexing Canada and making us the 51st state.
Yeah, I heard something about that.
He's referred to the Prime Minister as Governor Trudeau. So it's off to a kind of start.
I really like everybody in politics nowadays says, you're a liar, you're lying, it's a lie. What was the expression you just used? I like that so much better than lying.
A claim that lacks evidence?
A claim that lacks evidence. See, that's a more elegant way to call somebody a liar.
I think it would be parliamentary even.
There you go. You could get away with that. Yes, indeed. Now, in response, Canada has said it will spend $1.3 billion to strengthen the border. Canada's premiers, including Doug Ford, are set to visit Washington, D.C. on February 12th, likely to meet the President and members of Congress to, of course, reiterate Canada's strategic and economic value to the United States, which I guess some in the administration don't see at the moment. But anyway, the premiers will also be meeting their state counterparts at the National Governors Association in late February. So maybe some in-person appeals will help Canada create some carve-outs, which is, of course, what we're looking for in this tariff policy.
Right. And, we just mentioned the caretaker convention. And so I think one of the questions that we don't really have an answer for yet is, will Doug Ford be, in fact, part of these delegations? Will he, in fact, travel to Washington? It would be very unusual for the Premier to take part in one of these trips during an election campaign. It may have happened before. I can't think of a specific example. And it is the kind of thing that opposition parties would not unfairly complain about because of the caretaker convention itself. But if the election call does, in fact, happen next week, this may all, in fact, unfold.
Did you watch the Trump speech, the inauguration address?
I opted to preserve my mental health.
So you did not watch it?
I did not.
Okay. Well, let me just say a couple of things here about that. I think I've seen maybe 14 or 15 inauguration addresses going all the way back to Richard Nixon in the 1960s and 70s. They are usually forward-looking speeches. They are designed to appeal to the better angels in all of us as opposed to settling old scores. Trump did something, I guess we could say, a little bit different, with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris sitting literally a meter or two away from him. Trump excoriated the Biden record and essentially accused Biden and Harris of running a criminal operation during their time in the White House. Biden and Harris, I have to say, met the moment. They sat there with just poker faces. They kept their cool. I will confess there was a part of me that hoped that Biden would stand up, walk over to the president, put his arm around him and say, come on, buddy, as he does, come on, man. You are so full of El Toro poopa with this stuff, but he didn't.
Might have gone with malarkey.
Malarkey he might have gone with, yes, indeed. It's also notable, I think we have to put this on the record, that Donald Trump, rather disgracefully, did not extend to the guy who defeated him 4 years ago the same courtesy that the guy who defeated him 4 years ago just gave to him. Namely, he didn't show up. Biden showed up to this one. Kamala Harris was there. George W. Bush, William Jefferson Clinton, Barack Hussein Obama all showed up and demonstrated for the rest of the world what you are supposed to do at these moments, which is demonstrate that America is one big family transferring power from one party to the next. Trump couldn't meet the moment 4 years ago, but everybody else apparently did this time. I'm also reminded of the fact that, our countries are different. We don't have this tradition in Canada or in Ontario. The defeated premier does not show up to the swearing in or the installation of the cabinet of the victor. So you did not see in 2018 Kathleen Wynne go to Doug Ford's swearing in. You did not see Ernie Eves go to Dalton McGuinty's swearing in 2003. You didn't see Frank Miller go to David Peterson's swearing in 1985. We just don't do that. Different strokes for different folks. But Donald may want to consider that when he makes us the 51st state that, we're not going to show up to anyway.
Yeah. No, and folks may recall that when Premier Ford won in 2018, there was this public swearing-in ceremony for the new cabinet out on the front lawn of Queen's Park. God, that was a hot day. I just remember how sunny and hot it was. And, like the presidential inauguration, it's very much a ceremony for the friends and supporters of the incoming premier and his party. It doesn't quite have the same importance of a presidential inauguration, and it's not always done in public. Sometimes it's just, the lieutenant governor, and they put out photos or they do a TV feed, but it's not out in the open. When the legislature is recalled, though, and the new government delivers a throne speech, that's when, if the opposition leader is still an MPP after the election results, that's when that opposition leader would then show up and be in attendance for the throne speech.
Yes, as Kathleen Wynne was.
Yes, exactly.
In 2018. Time now for our regular feature, Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I reminisce about the stuff that we wrote for TVO.org this past week. What's up on your docket today?
So we mentioned the Roma conference earlier. You and I were at the conference, and I had the pleasure once again of moderating the Ministers' Forum, colloquially referred to as the Bear Pit, where Cabinet gets peppered with questions from elected municipal officials from all over the province, and that's always a lot of fun. But what is two things that are notable from Roma this year, both having to do with the broader municipal organization called the Association of Municipalities of Ontario. So it's not just rural, it's also the big cities. AMO is starting an ad campaign. They have never intervened in a provincial election in this way before, but they are registering as a third-party advertiser, and they are urging, in a nonpartisan way, they are urging Ontario voters to keep municipal affairs at the top of mind when they vote. They are particularly asking people to think about the infrastructure costs for servicing new housing, things like dealing with the homelessness crisis across the province, and the types of costs that municipalities have to bear in Ontario that are actually just covered provincially in other provinces. So healthcare costs being among many of those. So notable that AMO is not sitting back, not being meek or quiet in this election. But additionally, kind of a weird chapter in Ontario municipal politics has come to a close. 20 years ago, Toronto withdrew from AMO. Then Mayor David Miller believed that Toronto could represent its own interests better than it could through AMO. That period has now come to a close. Olivia Chow and Toronto City Council voted late last year to rejoin AMO, and so after a 20-year absence, every municipality in Ontario, and like the largest municipality and the provincial capital, are now back under one banner. And as I say, particularly at this time where AMO is trying to be a bit more of an active force in the provincial elections.
It's interesting that one new Democrat mayor took Toronto out of AMO, and another new Democrat mayor put Toronto back in AMO.
Yeah, I will say that the early work to start the negotiations to get Toronto back in did start under John Tory. But yes, a weird symmetry there.
Yeah.
Yes. And you?
Well, I want to talk about timing here.
Okay.
And my column starts by talking about a guy named Frank McKenna, which is a name which will mean something to those of us of a certain age. Frank McKenna became the Premier of New Brunswick 40 years ago. And he did something interesting when he won his first term. He said, if I do a good job, and if you honor me with enough election victories, I will serve 10 years as Premier of New Brunswick. And in fact, his first election was so amazing, he won every single seat in the legislature, and then he won 2 more majorities after that. And then, true to his word, 10 years almost to the day that he first became Premier of New Brunswick, he resigned, as he said he would. Yeah. He did his 10 years, and he's out. And he's had it's a textbook example of how you get into politics, you are successful, and you leave on your own terms. And people don't say, oh, look at him hanging around too long. And, he's had a good legacy as a result. And he's deputy chair of the Toronto Dominion Bank now, so he's had a very nice post-political life as well. Why am I raising this? For obvious reasons. There are so many first ministers, and I would obviously say Exhibit A at the moment is the current Prime Minister of Canada, who just don't know when to leave. Yeah. They overstay their welcome. They don't read the room. They dramatically overstay their welcome in some cases. And Justin Trudeau is only the latest example of many prime ministers and premiers who hung around a bit too long. Anyway, I've always been flummoxed as to why they do this. If they did the McKenna thing, which is, come and go in a reasonable period of time, you would leave office with more respect. You wouldn't look like you're clutching with your fingernails to hang on to this office. Your post-political career has every possibility of being better than it might otherwise be, and yet they don't do it. It's a mystery.
I mean, one of the tensions that I think you see a lot, particularly, I think the biggest example from your and my lifetime is the Canadian Federal Liberal Party with the animosity between Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin's various supporters, that it's very difficult to have a successor waiting in the wings and also be the prime minister. Maybe we're seeing a similar thing currently with Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland. Certainly her departure from his cabinet seems to have precipitated his decision to resign.
She put the shiv in and twisted, didn't she?
It was, from an observer's perspective, it was pretty spectacular. There are first ministers who have managed that transition, who have left gracefully and had a strong successor come up behind them.
Well, can I put one in the bank right here? I mean, Bill Davis is the obvious example. Even though the guy's the second longest serving premier.
And drink.
Yes, we did it. That's right. He's the second longest serving premier in Ontario history. And yet, when he left, his party was 25 points ahead of the second place party. And there's no question in my mind, he gave up the possibility of winning a fifth straight election by leaving when he did. Yeah. He left his successor a decent amount of time to put his own stamp on things. Didn't work out for his successor, but anyway, I think the point is we know the job is great.
Yes.
We know it's the best job they're ever going to have, being premier or prime minister. It's exciting. Bill Davis once said to me, Steve, the most fascinating day of being a corporate lawyer can't touch being premier of Ontario on the dullest. Okay? We know it's a great job.
Yeah.
But your reputation matters. Your legacy matters. And why you'd want to adversely affect it by looking like you're clinging to office when everybody wants you out, it's still a bit of a mystery to me. Anyways, okay, should we go into the mailbag?
Absolutely.
Let's do that. If you've got a burning question or insightful comment, please send it along to us at onpolitics@tvo.org, and Mr. McGrath has this week's letter.
Absolutely. So we've got a question here from listener Scott Irvin in Ottawa, who writes, "Hi, Steve and JMM. Big fan of the podcast. Love seeing your creative shirts every week. I just heard Doug Ford may call a provincial election as early as next week, and it got my family and I thinking, has there ever been a provincial election at the same time as a federal one in Canada? It would certainly be a wild time, not just for poll workers, but also for journalists like yourselves. Thanks for all you do, Scott Irvin from Ottawa."
Well, he's right about that, Scott. You're right. We spend a lot of time complaining about, oh my goodness, 2 elections in the same space of time. We love it. Yes. Come on, let's face it. We complain, but we love it. It's great. The most obvious example is 1867, when the country was born, right? We had a provincial and a federal election to start Canada and Ontario's birth. They were held at the same time. 2 interesting takeaways from those 2 elections. The winner in both cases was a guy named John Macdonald.
Yes.
Sir John Alexander Macdonald became our prime minister. Sir John Sandfield Macdonald became the first premier of Ontario. Interestingly enough, Sandfield Macdonald's statue is on the south lawn of Queen's Park, and you can see it in full view. John Alexander Macdonald's statue is still cladded up 4 years later because, of course, he's been canceled and we're not allowed to talk about him anymore. Anyways, so the results of the Ontario election were actually, Sandfield became the premier of Ontario, but technically it was a tie, wasn't it?
Yes. The Tories and Liberals each won 41 seats. So they formed a coalition government, a unity government. There are other times where the Ontario provincial election and federal election were in the same year, 1908, 1911, 1926, 1963, and 2011. And there was one more time, and perhaps not surprising when we think about it, that the elections did overlap substantially. In 1945, we had just come out of World War II, or I guess in the Pacific it was still raging, but the war in Europe was over, and both the federal and provincial governments decided to hold elections. There was a federal election on June 11th, and there was a provincial election a week earlier on June 4th.
And no, I did not cover that campaign. Neither one of them, despite what you might think. Apropos of what I'm wearing here, in 2011, the federal election was held in May. Stephen Harper, Jack Layton, Michael Ignatieff were the 3 main leaders. The provincial election was held the same year in October.
Yes.
Dalton McGuinty, Tim Hudak, Andrea Horvath. The 2025 federal election is scheduled for October. I think there's a pretty good chance it's going to happen before that.
Yes.
And of course, we're going to have an Ontario election probably in February or March. So not completely unusual to have both orders of government having elections in the same year. What is more, if I can just follow up on something here, what is more unusual is to have a winter election. We generally, because it is Canada, don't like to have winter elections. We've not had a winter election in the province of Ontario since Bill Davis's last majority government in 1981. That's 44 years ago. We've had 43 elections in Ontario history, 43, only 7 in the winter. It has become conventional wisdom that you should not, if you're the governing party, ask people to go to the polls when the weather is potentially awful, lest they take it out on you. And in fact, one candidate who is running in this upcoming election, I guess I can say her name, Jill Promoli, who right now is a trustee in Peel Region, and she's got the Liberal nomination in Mississauga Streetsville. Yeah. And she emailed me the other day saying, how am I going to be able to hammer lawn signs into the ground when it's minus 25 outside and the ground feels like concrete? Well, good question. We shall see.
So I actually have a kind of a morbid answer that comes from like reading histories before the 20th century, before people had like large excavation machinery. People die in the winter and you need to dig graves, and so what they would sometimes do is pour boiling water onto the earth to thaw it out, and then you dig, and then you get down to more frozen ground and you have to pour more boiling water on it. I don't imagine that's actually a practical answer for
okay, I was just going to say,
a tour campaign.
Number one, you are in a very dark, macabre space with that example. And number two, I don't think volunteers are going to be door knocking with pots of boiling water hanging around so they can get election stakes into the ground.
I mean, people might have boiling tar around for tarring and feathering.
I don't think it's on. Anyway, let's get out of here, please. That is our onpoli podcast for this January 24th, 2025.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Until next Friday, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
In order to graduate high school in Ontario, every student must pass the grade 10 civics course. That's been true for about a quarter of a century, but not without some bumps in the road, including uncertainty about its continuation and substantial curriculum revisions. With us now on how well we're weathering those and other challenges in the province, let's welcome Ken Boyd. He is Director of Education at Civics Canada. Nathan Tidridge, a high school civics teacher in the Waterdown neighborhood of Hamilton and author of several books, including Canada's Constitutional Monarchy, An Introduction to Our Form of Government. And Rachel Collishaw, pedagogical advisor in civic education at Elections Canada and a former Ontario high school history and civics teacher herself. Great to have you three here with us at TVO tonight for what is a timely and important discussion given how many elections we're likely to have this year. So let's start. Make the case as to why we need to know our civics.
Well, Steve, it's because it's so fundamental to our democracy that a democracy only works when citizens understand how it works and that they know how they can engage in the process. And so civic education is a fundamental part of that.
Nathan, make the case.
We live in a very diverse, complex society, and we need to understand how that society, that the democracy that we've built up here together, so we can better create the country that we want to have.
Ken.
Civics is really about learning how to live together. When we think about learning about civics, we often think about learning about things like systems of government, and these are all very important things, but it is really just fundamentally just about how we can live together and work together to create the democracy that we live in.
I know we have mandatory civics education in our elementary and high schools right now. Mm-hmm. Is it adequate?
I don't think so. I think that there needs to be a lot more emphasis on engaging in democracy well beyond the scope of the civics course in grade 10 or the civics curriculum in grade 5 in Ontario. I think that there's a lot of fundamental concepts and fundamental conversations that we all should be having throughout the school years, and that every teacher needs to have more understanding, but that there should also be more specialization.
There's only so many hours in a day. So you want to teach less math, you want to teach less English, you want to teach less art, you want to teach less shop, less gym. What do you want to teach less of so we have more time for civics?
I don't think I can answer that question.
You want to give it a shot, Nate?
Well, to answer your first question,
Yeah.
I'm going to say no. Civics right now is a half-credit course taught in grade 10. It needs to be a full credit. We need more time to be having these really, really important conversations. We also need to reverse the trend of civics going online, into online learning, because that's where the majority of our province's students right now are taking civics. And to me, that's a real problem.
What's the problem?
Well, how do you have conversations about, for example, treaty relationships, engaging the community, working with community partners? How do you do that in an online platform?
Well, you do it on Zoom.
Yeah, it's not the same. Just like how we're talking right now in person, it's important to be having these conversations, particularly at such a vulnerable age, in person in the classroom.
Ken, what do you say?
Well, I think the way that you've presented the problem as if we have more civics, we need less of something else, I think that's the wrong way to think about the problem. Civics is something, as we know, is something that is taught as its own separate half course, but it need not just be confined to a half course in the curriculum. So something that we've heard from talking with teachers from across Ontario and across the country is that overwhelmingly they see civics as a subject that is cross-curricular. So if we want to teach everything that we think students should know about civics, that's not something that needs to be confined to the grade 10 civics class.
So it's a part of other classes as well.
Yes.
Give me an example. There's not a focus on civics if you're doing art or gym or music, or is there?
There tends not to be, but we have seen a lot of really passionate and interested teachers who have tried to incorporate civics more in other classes of theirs. So we've seen, for example, science teachers who have looked at issues around single-use plastic bans. So they have seen this as not only it's a policy issue in one way, but it's also a scientific issue. What is the science around this? Why does this policy exist at all? So these kinds of subjects, they're not, completely separate from other kinds of important political and civic issues. And so we can incorporate some of that learning into other kinds of courses.
Can we compare and contrast here, Rachel? You told us a minute ago that we do it in grade 5 and grade 10 in the province of Ontario. Where does that put us compared to other provinces?
I was hoping you would ask this question, Steve, because many other provinces have actually included full-year civics courses rather recently. So Nova Scotia came out with one in 2019 in grade 9. That is their entire social studies curriculum is around civic engagement and in their social studies class. New Brunswick also came out with one 2 years ago for their grade 10 social studies. PEI has just adopted one in grade 9. Quebec has actually included a whole series on the culture and citizenship course.
So we're laggards.
No, I think we're doing okay in Ontario. I think there's other provinces where civics is not a standalone course, but for example in Alberta, the social studies curriculum is sort of all together in one social studies thematic course in grades 9 to 12, and all those courses are mandatory for all students, and so they have multiple opportunities to incorporate civics into the history, geography, law, politics, all of those other courses that they're taking.
When the province wanted to change the curriculum in civics, did you get consulted? Did they bring you in on that at all?
No. Well, there's a process. So the Ministry of Education does have a process, and so it's a cyclical process. It doesn't necessarily happen when it should happen, but they do have a way of engaging, and part of that does include engaging with teachers and stakeholders.
So you did offer your opinion when they asked for it?
Yes, I did, yes, and was part of one of the writing teams for that, yes.
Were you content that what emerged focused on the right things?
Yes and no. I'm really happy. I mean, treaty education has now been put into into our current curriculum.
Better explain what that is.
So what is a treaty? And these kind of foundational relationships between Crown and Indigenous people. Now, what I'd like to see is, what does that mean? And the resources given to teachers to kind of explore that in a better way. So when we're talking about our democracy, we're kind of talking about these relationships as well. So there's really good things in the curriculum. How teachers are able to access that curriculum and having the proper time to access that curriculum, that's another issue.
How old are your students?
14.
Are they interested in this?
Yes, they are interested. I mean, when you tell them kind of the story of our democracy, when you talk about treaty, when you talk about issues that affect them in the community, face to face, they are engaged. They will go where the teacher kind of wants to take them. So students are very much engaged and looking for ways to access their democracy.
I've known this guy for a while, and I know he's a damn good teacher. And I know I'd want to take his class if I were 14. I'm also betting that they're not all like him. And I guess I want to find out from you, Ken, is based on what you know about what's going on out there, how good are the teachers who are supposed to be inculcating our young people in this knowledge?
I think the teachers are great. Let me just start off with that. I do think that they are not receiving the kind of support that they both ask for themselves and that we might want them to have when they are from everyone. Pre-service training, in-service training, professional development opportunities, resources to go on field trips, to do things, to have projects in their civics classes. They are not being well served in that way.
You probably love to teach civics, right?
Yes.
I mean, it's part of your DNA. This is
Yes.
stuff that really jazzes you up.
Yeah.
Again, I'm willing to bet that most teachers are not like you. And now, I don't want you to get in trouble with your colleagues.
Right.
Well, maybe a little bit. But would you go so far as to say that a lot of them get voluntold to do it and that it's not a passion for them?
Part of the issue with civics being a half credit is that it is not a teachable. And so what I mean by that is you will have people that are teaching the course where they don't have a background in the subject. So it's often given to new teachers, or it's given to a teacher that, they have so many classes in the school, but they need to kind of fill out that timetable so that they can be fully in that school. And so the consequence of that is you'll have someone that might not be passionate in civics, and they come by it honestly. They want to do a good job, but that's not their training. And so, in some cases, I would say civics is not taught by the history department. It could be under the business department. You could have any teacher there, and so you get an unequal delivery of the curriculum, I would say.
Okay, Rachel, help me understand this. You're Elections Canada,
Yeah.
so you're a national organization.
Yeah.
Education is a provincial responsibility.
Indeed.
So, but part of your mandate is to make sure that citizens understand what's
Our
going on at
democracy.
election time and our democracy and all that kind of stuff. So do
Absolutely.
you have any money in your budget to give to schools to help teachers get up to scratch?
What we do is, like I was saying before, we keep an eye on all the provinces and territories and what they're doing in their curriculums. And in every curriculum across Canada, there is a requirement to teach about our electoral process, to teach about our elections, to teach about our democracy in a larger sense. So we look for those connections, and we know that teachers, regardless of their qualification or comfort level, are required by law to teach that curriculum, to teach about our democracy. So what we do is we provide resources to teachers. So like Ken, and we develop the resources, and we listen to teachers about what they need, and we try try to give them what we need.
Give me an example. What's a resource you would provide to a teacher?
So, for example, we have a resource called Voting Rights Through Time that is designed for the history classroom. And so you have 5 case studies of different groups throughout our history that did not have the right to vote in federal elections. And students get a set of cards and an activity mat that looks like a timeline, but like includes inclusion and exclusion. And they have to work together as a team to figure out and to think about, is this historical event, is this inclusion or exclusion, how much? And then they understand, and it springboards them to new questions around our democracy and who should be included and who isn't included today.
I'm going to take a shot out of the dark here. I don't know this, but I'm going to take a guess. I'm guessing that to run a proper election in Canada, 10 provinces, 3 territories, 5 time zones?
Sure, yeah. 5.5?
I don't know. $300 million.
Oh, no.
More?
Usually, I think the last election was between 500 to 600 million.
No.
So that included all the pandemic measures. But yeah, it's expensive to run an election because it happens everywhere, and we have to get to every community, whether there's roads or not.
For $600 million, okay, Ken, I'm going to ask you. For $600 million, should there be some money in there to make sure that teachers are adequately teaching civics to future voters?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I don't want to downplay the expense of running an election. Of course, that's sort of outside of my particular wheelhouse. But yeah, I mean, I think just in general, there needs to be more support and more funding opportunity, not only in terms of funding opportunities, but development opportunities to help teachers teach civics.
Elections Canada, Elections Ontario, should they have more responsibilities as it relates to civics and getting the word out?
I mean, they're putting out some really great resources already for teachers that we can use. An issue comes in with different teachers that are teaching civics, and it's a bit of a revolving door. Having that time and that collection of consistent teachers is critical so that they can access those, because if it's just somebody that's kind of thrown in there for their timetable's sake and then they go on the next year, there's that inconsistency. So I think for me it all goes back to it being a full course, because that gives us the time and a collection of expertise that we can access all of these resources.
Tell me this, is it tricky to teach this stuff knowing that if you're going to get into it, maybe you're going to get into issues as well, and when you get into issues as well, you run the risk of kind of snuggling up to the partisan line here, and that opens potential doors for parents to get mad at you. Why are you teaching my kid this, etc.? Is that difficult?
More often than not now, when you're teaching at the front of the room, you're teaching at the kitchen table. Like you realize that it's not just the student in front of you. But if you're not talking about issues, you're not teaching civics properly. Like, you want kids to be engaging around these issues and having their opinions. You have to do it in a safe and supported way. And at the end of the day, the students shouldn't be able to know which political affiliation you're in. And it is a tricky line. But that's why you become a teacher.
I got a fast story for you here. Yeah. I remember, we're going back 30 years now, Mike Harris is the premier. He's having fights with teachers all the time. And Chris Stockwell is a member of his cabinet, I think, from Etobicoke, Chris Stockwell. And his daughter's name is Victoria. And all the teachers of the day were not doing what you just suggested, Nathan. They were wearing buttons in classes with the word Tory in the button and then a red line slashed through it. And Chris Stockwell's daughter, Victoria, whom all her friends called Tory, came home from class and says, "My teacher's got a button on with my name on it and she hates me, my teacher." And Chris assured her, "Tory, she doesn't hate you, she hates me." Just to clarify, just to let everybody know. Ken, okay, your organization put out a report last year. You surveyed 1,400 teachers across the country. It found that only half the teachers felt highly confident about teaching civics. And outside of social studies, a quarter of the teachers saying they weren't confident at all about teaching the subject. What'd you take away from that?
Well, I think a lot of things that we took away from that. One was, kind of the discussion that we're having here about civics being that course that's sometimes forgotten about, the course that when it's treated as a half credit in Ontario, for example. We've heard a lot of teachers say that it being given that kind of role as the half credit makes a lot of people think of it as something that they don't really need to take that seriously. It's something that is, maybe it's a bird course, maybe it's something that it just ends. You don't build on it to continue out throughout your education. And that, as Nathan mentioned, it's not a teachable, right? So when you don't have the kind of training to get there, then it's difficult to be really passionate about it. It's difficult to cover everything you need to cover there. We saw teachers expressed a lot of frustration around their inability to do something that they really wanted to do well.
Okay, so there's every possibility that Jill Dunlop, the Minister of Education, and or her staff are watching this or listening to this right now. Lay an idea on them.
Okay, well, I think that we do need to think about civics as something that is, as I mentioned, something that is involved more so in the curriculum. It's something that needs to have more attention paid to it at the pre-service level. Like, teachers need to, when they're learning how to teach, learn how to teach civics. That should be, and not just social studies teachers, not just humanities teachers, but really everybody should be involved more in learning about civics. At the in-service level, there needs to be more professional development opportunities, more funding opportunities for teachers to get up to speed on some of these new things that we have seen put into the new curriculum.
Nathan, what would you recommend to the minister?
I would say that civics and history need to be seen as important as STEM. That there is an intrinsic value to our greater society for our students to know how their democracy and how their country and how their history works, and so we need to treat it as such.
Let's give the last word on this to Elections Canada. Not a partisan statement, just what could they do to improve things?
Yeah, I think I would agree with both of my colleagues here that more attention to teacher development is really key, because what we know is that when teachers don't feel confident in a subject, they will fall back on rote learning, and they won't be able to engage the students in conversation. And I think that's really detrimental in the civics classroom.
Making sure teachers are confident about what they're teaching, that is the best way to get the word out.
Agreed.
And it, like a ripple in the lake, it goes out from there.
Yeah.
Terrific. Let's thank our guest, shall we? Nathan Tidridge. And pick up his book, if you like, Canada's Constitutional Monarchy, An Introduction to Our Form of Government. It's a good start to figuring out what it is we actually do here. Rachel Collishaw, Elections Canada. Ken Boyd, Director of Education at Civics Canada. Thanks so much to you three. Great to have you at TVO today.
Thank you.
Well, this conversation, I would say, was particularly important given that today is International Day of Education. And in that vein, we've got a special programming note. Sunday night, 7 p.m., we've got an entire program, which these three guests will also be a part of. We'll put together a terrific group to distill in 1 hour the most vital things each of us needs to know to engage confidently in our democracy. Sort of like a civics lesson that won't feel like a civics lesson. It's part of TVO Today Live, and it airs on Sunday night, 7 p.m. Eastern Time on TVO on television and on our YouTube channel at TVO Today and on X. And we hope you can all join us for that. And that is the agenda for Friday, January 24th, 2025. Monday on the program, we'll look at whether Canadians still care about climate policy. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a great weekend, everybody, and we'll see you back here on Monday.